Well, we're at the top of the hour. Good morning and good afternoon, and thank you for joining our information session on threat intelligence. Today we have Malcolm Harkins and Mark French talking about a recent ebook from the Cyber Resilience think tank on threat intelligence. We're very excited to have them both here. They're both participants in the think tank. And what we'd like to do is have them present to you all insights that they've gleaned from the conversations they've had from the think tank, share that information with us. This webcast is being recorded for those who aren't able to make it. And then in the end, we'll open it up for Q&A. So let's get started. I'll hand it over to you, Mark.
So good morning, good afternoon, folks. I'm Mark French. I'm the Chief Trust Officer here at Mimecast. So today we'd like to talk a little bit about threat intelligence, a conversation that probably a lot of folks on the phone have been having internally. They're hearing a lot of buzz externally. There's a lot in the press. Everybody says you should do this, should you not do this? So we wanted to actually share some results of a conversation that we had as part of our think tank with respect to threat intelligence, and to show folks that it's probably not just for the 1%ers. So I think with that, we'll get started. There we go. So as I alluded to, and Malcolm's going to jump in as we talk through this, you know, most folks think of threat intelligence when they think of large organizations. And the reality of it is that most security organizations across the world are 10 or less people. Right? I think a lot of the folks on the phone would hear that and think that that's where they're at, and they may think that threat intelligence is out of reach for them. But the reality of it is I think threat intelligence is available to just about everybody who's listening to this webinar. It is not just for the large banks and the large technology firms in Silicon Valley. I think it's available. It should be used for even the smallest organizations that are out there. Malcolm, what's your opinion?
You know, I 1000% agree with you, and I saw this both when I was at Intel as Chief Security and Privacy Officer, and though I was a very large company in the tech industry, we didn't invest in spending millions and millions of dollars on threat intelligence. We had a lot of intelligence already, and what we did was gather that information from peers, partner with other organizations, use open source intelligence, and we used it tactically, but we also used it strategically and proactively because we created a quarterly, in essence, review of the intelligence that we knew that we weren't harnessing, so that we could take a more proactive footing going forward. So it was a bit of business process, and it was a little bit of what I'd say a crowdsourcing from not only within the organization, but from external sources.
Yeah, and I would say, Malcolm, that one of the best resources that an organization has for intelligence is your own infrastructure. You are sitting on a tremendous amount of data about what's going on in your environment, and just capturing and harnessing that will get you a long way towards kind of moving to that more protective state. And that kind of hits number 2 in this bullet list is budget, resources, and skill sets. I would say to you that you probably don't need a large budget to get started. You're probably already doing this. From a resources perspective, you already have staff, whether it's 1 person, 10 people, 50 people, because you're already actually doing a lot of the heavy lifting that you're going to need for this. And then from a skill set perspective, here's where there's a little bit of tweak. You're going to need to probably learn a little bit more on how to interpret the data that you already have with respect to transforming that threat data that you have into intelligence. Malcolm, thoughts on this?
I totally agree with you. And I think organizations, even the smaller ones, can look, what I'll say, in non-traditional places. Almost every company has a marketing organization and business development teams. And you might think that this is not a place to look, but businesses have to do competitive intelligence on the marketplace. So there's intelligence skills in almost every organization. The question just becomes, how do you perhaps even tap them and get their perspective and maybe their help occasionally in terms of ways in which you can harness, again, open source information and garner insight and intelligence out of it versus the traditional, I'd say, security mindset of I've got all these indicators of compromise. Indicators of compromise is threat information. The intelligence that you can really get out of it is to really look at if there's an indicator of compromise, that's a tactical blocking and tackling thing. You got to step back and get the real insight out of it, because if a compromise occurred, that means a control failed. The real intelligence is to go figure out what control failed and then go fix that control.
And Malcolm, you highlight an important thing that we probably should discuss, the difference between threat data and threat intelligence. So I come from a classic military law enforcement background, so this is near and dear to my heart. You can collect a whole bunch of IOCs from a whole bunch of different vendors. You can go to open source. Intelligence equals action. If you're not actually willing to take that next step from the stuff that you're learning to actually improve your position, then it's not really intelligence. So it's important, as Malcolm alluded to, that you've got to take what you're learning and actually do something with it. So you got to go beyond just grabbing data and looking at stuff. You actually have to move to a position where you're affecting the security posture of your organization. Which kind of talks a little bit to number two. We're always in number three, we're always in this reactive state because we can't get ahead of it. Intelligence allows you to get ahead of it. You do not want to be in a constant reactive state, and I know a lot of folks on this webinar are going to be challenged because, especially in the smaller teams, you're going from fire to fire to fire, and you're not given the ability to be reactive. Think about intelligence being a force multiplier in this process. So how do I go from being 100% reactive to being a little bit more proactive and helping me downstream? Thoughts on that, Malcolm?
Again, I completely agree with you. And the best way to strategically take the threat information and data feeds and the tactical intelligence you're using for the blocking and tackling is, like I said, go figure out if you've found a compromise, you got an indicator of compromise from somebody else, you use it, you see that you've got something going on in your network, you block and tackle it. But if it got into your network, it indicates something failed. Take that next step, figure out how the compromise occurred, what control failed, and then go fix that control, or frankly, get rid of the control that didn't work and get one that will.
So I want to talk a little bit about point number 4 on this slide and roll it back to point number 2. So it's accessible for you folks on the phone. It's not something that's just for the 1%er. So how do I operationalize that statement? Back to budget, resources, and skill set. So what does a budget look like for an intelligence team or an intelligence function? I would tell you that it's much smaller than you think it is. If you're going to go the route that Malcolm suggested, there's a lot of open source opportunities for you to gather that data. If you take your internal data, you could probably do this on a shoestring budget in your organization. You do not need to spend tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in threat intelligence fees to get the value that you can get out of intelligence. From a resourcing perspective, you all employ smart people. So I suspect that there are folks in your team that have the capability to actually interpret data. They're in the security function. This is what they do day to day. They have the aptitude to do this. They may need a little bit of understanding on how to translate what they see to action. But again, I think, sometimes YouTube is your friend. There are places that you can get for free that will teach you how to make that jump from interpretation to actually action. Malcolm, what do you think?
No, I think you're totally right. And without trying to do an infomercial, I'll give you an example of a threat and intelligence report that Cylance published a couple of weeks ago called Operation Shaheen. Is an exhaustively detailed analysis of a cyber attack from what we believe is a new nation-state actor against the Pakistani Air Force. Now, a lot of people might look at that and say, well, why is that relevant to me? I'm making widgets Kansas, and I'm not the Pakistani Air Force, and that's a nation state actor. Well, when you dig into the details of the report, you would see that what we found was there were 8 different traditional antivirus solutions that were bypassed and actually used as a part of the attack. There's actionable intelligence there, because if you're using one of those antivirus, you know now in no uncertain terms that it's easy to bypass. And so you can look at open source intelligence even for things that might not be in your industry, and again gain insights that will help you understand your control environment and where you may have an issue and things that you might want to do about it.
So I think we've gone through this slide. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So an organization's probably stepping back saying, you know, can I build this internally? You know, is it within the capability? I know we talked about budget, we talked about resources, we talked about skills. You know, I see all of that, and I hear you folks talking to me, but can I really do this? The reality of it is you don't necessarily have to do this all yourself. An organization doesn't necessarily have the team. You can outsource this. I know it's I'm putting in air quotes, the O in the room, but the reality of it is you don't necessarily have to do this. I would submit to you, you need to do this function, whether you physically do it or not, is really a decision that you may need to make organizationally. Thoughts on that, Malcolm?
No, I completely agree with you, and I think, you know, getting some type of either open source feed or outsourcing the feed through some of the mechanisms that's mentioned here on the slide are not that expensive. But still, at the end of the day, it's information, and getting back to what we said earlier, it's not really intelligence and actionable unless you're stepping back and doing some type of review on the information you're getting, the value it provided, and other things you can do to manage and mitigate risk. And so setting up a monthly or quarterly business process to kind of go through this doesn't cost a lot of money. It takes an hour or two's worth of time for a few people and a little bit of gathering of the data from the prior time period and going through it and doing a little bit of a look back as well as a look ahead. And that doesn't cost a lot. It just takes a little bit of time.
So I'll share with you a story that I can relate to. Item number 1, and I would say if there's one takeaway that you guys can take from this of what an organization can do, the number 1 thing you should focus in on is relying on your vendors, right? So if there's nothing else that you do, you don't stand a team, you don't build a budget, if there's one thing that you could start with that you probably have the opportunity to do today is rely on your security vendors. They are your force multiplier in getting through to intelligence. So I'll share with you a little bit of a story. So I was the CISO at a moderately sized business, a few $100 million in revenue, had a team of 6. You know, we had a large externally facing internet footprint, and I knew that folks were coming after me every day. I'd hung a shingle on the web, you know, just like any other organization out here, this is gonna happen to you. I was getting attacked, I'll put that in air quotes, every day. You know, how could I get visibility into enhancing my protection profile? By using the intelligence. What I did personally is I leaned in on my vendors. So I had a firewall infrastructure, I had an IDS, IPS infrastructure. Instead of me having to do all of the research to understand how to protect my environment, I actually reached back out to my vendors and said, hey, you all have a research team that I don't have. You're actually much better at this than I am. Please help me increase my protective measures in the environment by providing me the intelligence I need to stop the attacks that are coming into my environment. So, and I did that for almost no cost, because the reality of it is I already had the gear installed. I just needed to turn on the stuff that I had already bought and have that conversation with the vendor to make sure that I understand how to interpret the results. And I did that for very little dollars. And now all of a sudden I went from a team of 6 information security professionals having a research team of 300 because I had all of these vendors doing a lot of this work for me. So if I was an organization and there was one thing that I could focus in on, I'd probably start there because likely you have this gear in your environment anyway, and all you really need to do is turn it on and work with your vendors to start. Malcolm, thoughts?
No, I totally agree with you. And there's another, what I'd say, twist to how you can sometimes think of intelligence. Mark Twain had a quote, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure." Now, some threat actors and threat agents will intentionally create noise and indicators of compromise as a distraction. So you also have to be really cognizant of some of the threat and intelligence data being misleading indicators for what's actually occurring as an intentional distraction to you. And again, it's how you take this information and take action on it. And is the action you're taking, part of the attacker's plan so that you're distracted from what they're actually doing? They're rattling the front door and you run to that while they're actually climbing in the second floor window.
Yeah, it's an interesting challenge as you think about organizations to do that, what I'll call second and third order thought process, because most of the times, especially for smaller organizations, they're challenged a little bit with just protecting the things that they can see right away. And now we're asking, and this is where intelligence comes in, to think in that second and third order problem where you're going from, it's just not knocking at the front door, but I'm knocking at the side door, or maybe I left the back door open, or they're coming in through the garage. They've gone on top of the garage and through the window upstairs. So all of that, rely on folks that have the experience. I mean, that's the one takeaway I'll give you, because you may not have that experience to know and think of that second and third order problem. Your vendors have that. Let's talk a little bit about managed security providers. So this is a hot topic in the information security community today. A lot of people pro, a lot of people con. We're not really going to get into the politics of discussing the pros and cons of managed service providers, but what I will tell you is a lot of MSPs have a practice here and they can provide value to you. So again, if we're looking for ways to supplement your team and intelligence, MSP might be the route that you need to take organization. You need to step back and think about whether or not that's the right choice for your organization. But I will tell you, there's some really good MSSPs out there that have intelligence practices well beyond capabilities that even some of the largest organizations have. Malcolm, not being political, what are your thoughts on MSSPs?
To be honest,
I know, I got it.
Yeah, I think MSSPs are a great, again, getting back to what you said, force multiplier. They can do your day-to-day blocking and tackling. They can put you in a better strategic position. It's a way to get span and reach to cover more ground. And so I think they're a great resource. Now, again, with being a tad political, but I'll state this for the entire security industry, and most people have heard me say this before, the security industry profits from the insecurity of computing. So you also have to think of, is your service provider and is your vendor making money off of your continued problems? And if they are, you still need to use them, but you also have to be selective in terms of really understanding, do they make money off of alert volumes? And if they do, again, how do you reduce the incidents? How do you reduce the noise? How do you capture a better signal? And so utilize them, but also don't put yourself in a strategic disadvantage that your vendor is now taking advantage of you because you've completely removed yourself from the decision-making and strategy. So just be careful of how you utilize your vendors, because at the end of the day, you still own the strategy, you still own the decision-making, and you need to recognize them as a component to what you're accountable to do.
Yeah, because ultimately you are accountable. You can't foist that on your vendor. So that protective process, you're overall responsible for the protected footprint of your environment. So these folks are here to help you get to that point, but as Malcolm alluded to, it's still your responsibility and accountability to get this done. You can't basically sign that away to your MSSP provider or even solely rely 100% on your vendors to do the work for you. Ultimately, at the end of the day, you're going to be responsible to your executive committee and your board of directors for that security. They're not looking to those folks. So just keep that in mind as you build the program. So
Hey, Mark, just one other, one other addition to that that's a good way to, what I'd say, keep your vendors and your MSSP in check is to do pen testing. Again, see what control failed, but then if you're able to get through with the pen testing, how quickly did the MSSP detect it and mitigate it? It's a great way to see how well they're doing and what you're expecting them to deliver to you.
So let's talk a little bit about sharing. So this is an interesting topic. It seems a little bit daunting. So people say sharing, I'm just having a challenge getting my own intelligence together. How do I share? I would submit to you, as an organization, you need to share. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about what that means, but I would tell you that we're better together than we are separately. That in no situation do we want to be an island in the middle of the Pacific. I'll just pick a random ocean. That I really want to actually talk to all the islands around me because they're all experiencing the same tropical heat wave I am, or the same cyclone that's happening, or whatever that is. I want to understand, because together we're much better combating that as opposed to acting as an independent silo. Thoughts on sharing, and we'll dive a little deep about how you share, because we want to be prescriptive in here and give you some guidance. But thoughts on sharing, Malcolm?
Again, 1000% agree with you. I think there's a variety of ways you can do it, whether it be you get engaged tactically with a local InfraGard chapter and create relationships. If you have other peers that you know and you connect with them so that it's, again, not only tactical, I just saw this on my network, I just saw these on these systems, so that you can help each other, but also, like I said, strategic. If you saw it on your network or you saw a foothold on your system, what solutions did you have in place that didn't work? That again is things that I'd say sometimes get missed in the information sharing because we're focused on indicators of compromise versus what worked. If somebody else had the issue, okay, great, now let's get the indicators of compromise, what control failed. If I didn't have the issue, what about my control environment protected me? That again is useful collaboration between peers so that we can raise all boats together.
So I'll share a story about how folks can get started. So a few jobs ago, I was a CISO at a large hosting organization, and we had just launched into Asia. It was a region that we had not had any experience with, didn't really know the threat profile, and we were struggling. We were getting challenged, we were getting hit at the perimeter all the time, and I just didn't have enough visibility into what I needed to worry about. And one of my staff people who was based in Japan reached out to me and said, hey Mark, there's this forum in Tokyo of all the CISOs that talk about these things, and they share data. And would you mind if I go? And I said, no, how much does it cost? He says, you know what, it's free. We're a company based in Japan. They have what they call Chatham House rules in the US, which is whatever set here stays here. And we go and we share. And I sent my employee there, and I will tell you, for no cost, I had a tremendous amount of data that I got just by attending this local, regionally based intelligence sharing platform. And the cost to me to get and gather this data that helped me increase my protective posture was effectively whatever the cab ride cost to go from the office to the meeting and the dinner that he bought while he was there. So this does not have to be a heavy lift. And I will tell you the things that I learned out of that to help me in the APAC region were 10 times more beneficial than it was probably for me to buy a regional threat intelligence team. So that sharing, I would submit to you, is critical for you guys as an organization. It's also critical for your staff, and it's also going to be critical for you to raise your protector. Malcolm, any thoughts on sharing?
Yeah, you know, I think you're totally right, and I've had similar examples, and you know, I'll give you one from back when I was at Intel as Chief Security Officer. Joshua Davis, who's now at Toyota, he was Chief Information Security Officer at Qualcomm. Him and I chatted very routinely. Intel and Qualcomm were market competitors, but we didn't see ourselves as competing with each other, right? And so the other thing you have to think about is, you know, people in similar industries and where the company might be competing doesn't necessarily mean that the security organizations can partner together. The other aspect on sharing that sometimes a lot of people get afraid of is the repercussions of it. And I know a lot of organizations, their legal team or their executives don't want that because they're afraid of that information leaking, and you share information with Joey over at another organization that you've had an issue, and all of a sudden it makes its way into the press and stuff like that. You have to navigate those issues, but I'll also be blunt. Having a legal document with an NDA, that's a legal contract. It doesn't necessarily mean you have a trusted relationship with the peer. And most of the sharing I've ever done, I don't want a piece of paper and an NDA because it says we can't trust each other. I want somebody that I can genuinely trust, which means you have to develop a relationship, which means you have to make yourself a little bit vulnerable at times by sharing things and being the first mover, in essence, to provide information in order to help others. And I think it's reciprocal. People will provide it to you.
And I think, Malcolm, you highlight something that's been critical to me in my past, my ability to be successful in the past, is relationships do matter. You know, build those relationships with your peers. They will pay off tenfold. So organizations, to Malcolm's point, need to get out there and have those conversations with their peer groups, because the reality of it is I still get calls today from folks and other CISOs that I know that will reach out and say, hey, Mark, I heard about this. I know you're in this particular industry. It's not really relevant to us, but you should be aware of that. That's only built with trust relationships that I've had over time. So again, you know, if organizations are looking for things to take away, make yourself open and available, drive those relationships. They will pay off for you tenfold in the future. All right, let's move on to the next slide. So Malcolm, I'm going to have you lead this slide. How's that? And then I will follow.
Yeah, that works. And again, I think there's 4 key points here that are, to some extent, fairly obvious. You know, there's the inventory, and as we said, we all have a lot of systems there. They're casting off a lot of data. How do we understand that? How do we prioritize it? But you've got to understand your inventory. We've mentioned open source intelligence. There's lots of publications out there that have information, and you can tease insights out of them. You know, having an incident database, it's knowing what you've experienced in the past, so that way you can understand root cause and get in front of it going forward is key. And then, you know, again, this last part, know your security stack and know how they integrate together or sometimes overlap, so that way you can, again, manage what I'll call the seams between them, because that's where you can also gain insights. So for me, it's being systematic in the collection of information, the interpretation of it, and then making good decisions tactically and having the right strategic dialogue so that, again, we can take action to be proactive versus constantly reactive. Mark, I know you've had a ton of experience in this, and we had these type of dialogues with the think tank. And these are the 4 points, but you might have a slightly a different perspective, or maybe another point to add to the 4 that are already on here.
Yeah, so if I had to, stack rank these, put these in order of priority, right? So a lot of folks want to understand, how do organizations start? You've given me 4 things. How do I progress through a journey to threat intelligence? The number one thing you need to do is conduct your inventory. You cannot derive data to action if you don't actually know what you have underneath the covers. So if I had to stress probably the first and most important thing an organization needs to do before they go down this path is you got to know what you have. This is tough. I mean, every organization I've ever worked at struggles with this. I will tell you that what I've seen is on the hardware side and the software side, it's actually getting a little easier because the tools are out there, even that are baked into the core Microsoft environments and Linux environments, for you to get a pretty reasonable inventory of the gear that you have on premise and the software you're running. Where I've been challenged in the past is my cloud environments. So you all probably experienced this. Your credit card is your worst enemy from a security perspective because I can just buy Amazon Web Services with my P card and get reimbursement. You got to get a handle around how that works. I would say the most difficult piece is your data. Data is exploding across your universe. You have data lakes that you are not aware of. They contain data that you may not know about. It's going to be critical for you all to figure out where that is, because you can't derive where your risks are to drive the data that you need to collect to drive to intelligence if you don't know even what you're collecting to begin with. So if you don't know you have credit cards, how are you going to drive what the latest threats are to credit card processing to know that I need to create an action to protect the credit cards and a data lake that I had no idea that I had? So if I had to pick one that's probably the most critical for organizations to wrap their hand around, it's inventory. And I'll be honest with you, we've been talking about this for 20 years in the InfoSec community. It's been kind of that goalpost that we're trying to drive down towards forever. I feel personally we're getting closer to that, but I would say the biggest thing that's probably an open eye right now is on the data side. So if I had to pick one to focus on that second. Excuse me, first.
Hey, Mark, and to add into that, if your staffing and budget are lean, as we've talked about, and you might find it too daunting of a task, and inventories change just like in a warehouse. So there's also the how do you keep it up to date challenge. Folks can get creative. Go to a local college or community college and go get some interns. People that are hungry to learn, that will go do some of this work at a substantially lower rate than hiring staffing or even outsourcing it. So there's also a creativity approach to this stuff in terms of sometimes how you can do it on a leaner budget and use interns to do certain actions for you. It might not be perfect, but it'll move the needle in the right direction.
And you do highlight an interesting point, Malcolm. This is not a one and done for organizations. This is a continuous process. So this process that you're embarking on needs care and feeding. Just like my cat, I do need to feed her every day and things like that. So this is the same way. You can't just feel that I'm going to check these boxes and then all of a sudden have an intelligence program that's relevant 6 months from now. You need to actually care and feed this process as you're going forward. So organizations, as they're planning, one of the takeaways is you need to figure out how you're going to run this program going forward. So we can do all kinds of planning and set it all up and make sure that we understand how to do it today. But part of your plan needs to be able to articulate how you're going to maintain this and grow this program over time. Because if you don't, all you have is a stale footprint of your current threat landscape today that, let's be honest, changed 20 minutes ago. Because that's how dynamic the environment is that we're working in.
And just to add to that, Mark, as I've mentioned before, you can do the care and feeding and maturation, whether it be a monthly review or a quarterly review, and just step back and see where you've been, where you're at, and where you want to head with it, so that you're constantly doing a status check on the health of what you're doing and how you're doing it, and then making decisions about that, because that will then generate the business process to make sure you're doing that care and feeding, or make the decisions that says it's good enough for now and just stay on top of it until you have the resources, the time, the budget to enhance it.
So I guess let's move on to the next slide, please. So Malcolm, you want to start with parting advice?
Yeah, again, the top one is, I think, the most paramount. We talked about this at that sharing stuff. It's a great way, even if you don't think you have data to share, start with sharing something. Focus on yourself. What did you learn about something? How do you gain insights internally? And some of, again, the data sharing, besides external, there's internal data sharing. Is the business going to be launching a new product? Well, that's insight that if you know from the marketing team, that might be generating, as soon as you go to do that launch, a website and advertising. Does that change the threat landscape? Does that put you at risk of a DDoS? Does it put you at risk of something else? So there's other parts to the sharing of information that even can be within the company in terms of understanding the business evolution that allows you then to take proactive steps to manage the risk.
And I can't stress it even further that Malcolm stressed, that focus on you first. Like I had said earlier, you have a tremendous amount of data in your environment. Leverage that before you start ingesting things from the outside. I suspect that you will learn a tremendous amount based on the data that you already have in your environment. So start there. And if I was an organization and you asked me where I was going to start, look at your log files. And if you don't have log files, you probably want to turn those log files on, because that will provide you a lot of telemetry that you probably don't have. But focus on you first, because I suspect you will learn a tremendous amount by that. And I would also highlight a second point that Malcolm made. Talk to the other groups. So a lot of times a security organization will operate in silos. As a security organization, one of the things that you need to do is reach out to your peer organizations, because I will tell you they're gathering intelligence that you may not be aware of. So Malcolm highlighted earlier the marketing department. There's a competitive intel team likely in your organization or some part of that. They have a tremendous amount of data. Your analyst relations people have data that they could have access to. Your engineering teams see things through the application logs that have a tremendous amount of data in them. Use your internal resources first. Focus in on the you before you start focusing on everybody else.
And one other group to add into there, Mark, as well, or two other groups. It could be your legal team, right? Is there a pending lawsuit? And if that happens, what's that going to mean? Your HR team, is there going to be a shutdown of a plant? And if you know that ahead of time, you can take steps to manage and mitigate insider risk or other issues, or be more proactive in perhaps data loss, because if you're going to be doing a reduction in force, you might be triggering insiders who might want to take data or do something to harm the company. So again, building those trusted relationships internally so that you have, I'd say, early intelligence of corporate decisions and corporate directions that can change the internal as well as external threat landscape is paramount to managing the risk.
So I'll tell you a story about number 2, where it says be selective about intelligence feeds you consume. I will tell you that I had a friend, I won't tell you where, who made the determination that they needed to do intelligence, right? They had a protective measure that they needed to put in place. They felt intelligence was going to do this. And this person went off and consumed every open source feed possible, and they went ahead and spent $100,000 to buy 9 different feeds that they could get from vendors. I will tell you, number 1, they drowned in data. And as a result of that, they drove no action. Number two, the efficacy of what they had across the 14 feeds that they had was incremental once they got beyond 2 or 3. So the reality of a lot of things like indicator of compromise feeds is they're about 90% the same. And then you start getting a little bit of delta. So after a while, you're spending a lot more money to close a smaller and smaller gap. There's less of a return on investment on that for the money that you're spending. That capital may be better spent somewhere else. So what ended up happening with this person is they spent $280,000 on intelligence feeds, plus the open source feeds. They basically seized up his organization because they could not consume and drive data to action to actually make something successful out of the feeds that they have. So I guess the takeaway from the story is be selective on what you choose. The reality of it is you don't need, most organizations do not need 10 threat intelligence feeds. Use the ones that you think are going to drive the best protected profile. I would submit to you that's likely a handful to get you started. Anything more than that, you should start to question about the incremental gains that you're going to get by adding that additional exhaust into the system. Because that extra 6, 7, and 8 may be only taking 0.5% of the overall universe. And for the extra effort, could you better spend that money somewhere else, say shoring up your perimeter or shoring up your network on the inside? Thoughts on feeds, Malcolm?
I think you're exactly correct, and this is where 2 and 3 on this list go together. Because unless you're selective, you're not going to have actionable data. You're going to be drowning, as you said with your example, in alerts. So you're going to have alert fatigue, and that alert fatigue is going to lead to detection deficit disorder. You're going to miss the signal because you've got too much noise.
So let's move on to automation. So one of the biggest force multipliers organizations can look at, figure out how to go from that data to action, is use automation. You know, a lot of times, I'm guilty of this, you know, back in the day, I wanted an army of SOC analysts, you know, typing on keyboards, logging on to boxes, doing stuff. The reality is, no one's going to be resourced to do that. And in a lean enterprise, even less likely. So the way to get the bigger bang for your buck, or rand or pound, however we want to look at it, is to actually use automation to drive this process. Now, it's a little daunting, I'll be honest with you, because a lot of security professionals, me being one of them, was not comfortable in coding, and this is going to involve some kind of coding and automation. So I would also submit to you that the world's a-changing, and your security professionals are going to actually need to learn how to code, because automation is the only way that we're going to scale against the threats that we're seeing today. So as an organization, one thing to consider is, how am I going to hire the right people and drive this automation story? Because if I don't think that even at a lean enterprise, I'm going to be able to keep up with it. Thoughts on automation, Malcolm?
I completely agree with you, and I think the automation goes through the entire, what I'd say, security stack. Where today our approach to information security is so economically inefficient, we've been throwing bodies at the problem, adding to our SOCs, having to outsource to MSSPs because of just the growing alert volumes and the failure of control to adequately manage and mitigate the risk. And we've got to look at automation, whether it be reducing, malicious emails coming in, reducing malicious code execution. How do I create an orchestration automation layer for my SOC rather than just have the security event information management system that is this big data warehouse that I'm drowning in? And so we've got to look at it and go, how do we get ourselves to be more efficient and run it like a business? And if, again, we were running a factory, we'd be focused on yield, right? How much output am I getting for my human capital as well as my physical capital in the factory? And if we look at this like a factory, we have to get more process automation in order to get yield out of our resources. And so again, automation for me is a critical way to do that, but we've got to, again, put on that business mindset and then go about where we can get the most economic value out of the automation investments.
So I'm full of stories today. We'll talk about number 5, and this is me, so full transparency. So my first job at CISO was around the time, Mandiant was, I'll use another name, pushing out reports on China and a few other things, and a few other nation state actors. And we found some indicators compromising the environment. And I said, wow, and we got this big shiny report from this vendor that says the world's ending. And I package that all up, right? And I go to the executive committee meeting. I'm like, look at this, right? We saw this. We see this report that came out, right? Intelligence. We should do something. Here's what the problem is. I could never forget it. So the CFO leans over to me and he goes, so what? The reality, I learned a valuable lesson that day about what to share and what not to share in an organization. And this is more art than science. I will tell you that not every bit of intelligence needs to be shared up and across. Like I said, valuable lesson that day, never gonna put myself in that situation again. But to this point on number 5, just be smart about the information you share with the executives. You do not want to be me who gets the lean over saying, so what? That creates just an uncomfortableness that you will only do once. So Malcolm, I don't know if you have a story around this, but that was my story around this.
I do, and it dates back several years ago from when I was at Intel, and folks might remember what was called Operation Aurora when Google went public and said the Chinese had gotten into their environment. My team and I had been working that for weeks, almost months, with a bunch of peers, again, because we were sharing information with each other. And it's who you tell, how you tell, and when you tell, because in those circumstances, early information, you shoot off too much of a flare too early, you're going to create a panic. And that's not good, and you're going to get help you don't need. And so you've got to be measured in that approach. And in doing that the right way, I think you can alleviate an overreaction effect that can occur. And, luckily, we were able to manage that. But I remember the first time I was sitting down with Paolo Otellini, Intel CEO, and explaining what was going on to him. I luckily had timed it right where I had enough information, because his initial reaction was alarmist, which was on the one hand good, but I had to calm him down. And then when I explained to him where we're at and what we were doing and who we were partnered with as a cross-organizational set of things to go manage it, because I didn't need him to take action. I just needed him to be aware and be poised for a decision at some point, because that's what his role was. His role was not to go take action. His role was to be informed and to make a decision when I needed him to make it. And so also being clear with your executives on what their role is and what your role is as a part of sharing the information is critically important. Otherwise, they might exacerbate the situation and create a swirl for you, which will be distracting to what you're trying to do.
So I just want to summarize. We've come to the end of the presentation. And we wanted to end with parting advice, because we want organizations to understand, where they need to go on this next part of the journey. Our goal today was to share our experiences across the think tank. There are a lot of smart folks in this organization, and we all have an opinion. We wanted to get this out to you so that you could help to understand the trends that drive the threat intelligence practice. So I thank you all, and Malcolm especially, for joining us today. I do think we have some open questions, but I'll also give Malcolm a second to do his parting words as well. So So Malcolm, over to you.
Well, you've been telling stories, and I like quotes. I'll close with another quote, not from Mark Twain, but T. Dewar, the Scottish distiller from the late 1800s, early 1900s. He had a quote: "Minds are like parachutes; they work best when open." That is, keep an open mind when you're looking at this stuff, and be very cognizant of the choices you're making with the data and information you're getting so that it's actionable.
Right.
So with that, moderator, do you have questions for us today?
Yes. Hi, back to me. Thank you again all for joining today. We covered a lot of topics, and we just have a few questions. And if you have any questions in the next few minutes, please feel free to type them into the Q&A section of the webcast. The first question looks like someone who read the ebook and is asking about the word data exhaust and wanted to know a little bit more about what that means. And I think we covered some of this today in terms of a lot of alerts, but maybe.
So I'm going to give this to Malcolm because I think he talked a little bit about this
data
and
exhaust.
some of the things that he talked about,
Yeah.
signal and noise. So Malcolm, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, it's again that alert fatigue, and it gets back to some of the points that you've made. If all you're doing is consuming tons of feeds, if all you're doing is collecting more and more logs, you're creating, in essence, exhaust. You're clouding your environment, and you're not getting the right signal to noise ratio so that it's actionable. Now, sometimes you've got to go collect all that stuff, and getting to the point here on automation, then you got to automate it and, in essence, since I used a quote from a distiller, distill the information into something that's more enriched. So it's a little bit of the enrichment process, and it's a little bit of being selective on what data you really need to use, and being focused on where you can take action based upon that.
So I'll share a little bit of story about how we arrive at exhaust, because it's a car analogy. So I put the gas, your intelligence feed, into the engine of the car. Now, when we talk about intelligence, it's driving action. So if I don't actually put the car into gear and drive down the road, my road to intelligence, all I'm doing is pushing exhaust out the back of the muffler and filling up the garage. So the reality is, the reason we chose that, we like that analogy because it's a worldwide analogy, that you're just sitting through the exhaust, and if the car is not actually moving forward by putting the gas of data in, you're not actually getting any value of the gasoline that you're putting in the engine.
And to use a car analogy, if you go get a Tesla, you can reduce the exhaust and you can have more torque, meaning you can get more traction on what you're doing. And that would be a level of automation that even can reduce the exhaust by focusing on what type of, in essence, automobile you're driving.
So we went down the car rabbit hole a little bit. So why don't we go to the next one?
Hopefully. Yeah, no, that's great. One other question: how do organizations best vet their threat intel vendors? Magic Quadrant leaders?
Wow.
Is there a summary for
So
vetting?
So here's my approach I would take. The best source of intelligence about intelligence vendors is your peers, right? So we went back to this earlier. Gartner's a good company. They have a Magic Quadrant. The reality, what I found the best way to vet a vendor is to ask your peer group. So get out and talk to folks, because they've probably experienced this as well. If it's someone that they've never used before, I would caution tread lightly. So that's when the Gartners of the world are actually beneficial in helping us. But I think, or Forrester or any one of the other major vendors, I think the challenge that you have is there's so many of them today, there's no possible way that you can go across the universe. So you need to winnow down the list a little bit. The best way that I found to winnow down the list is talk to your peer groups. Drive those relationships we talked about earlier as part of sharing, because they're going to share with you, I really like this vendor, didn't really like this vendor, this is where this vendor helped, this is where this vendor didn't help. Malcolm, comments on that?
Again, complete agreement. I think the analyst reports are useful, but don't base your decision based upon them, because in many cases, those analyst reports, you got to think about how they make their money. And if they make their money because a vendor's spending a lot of money with them, it's kind of like Car and Driver magazine using another automotive thing. Is the report on the car that it's a fantastic car because they just spent a gazillion dollars to put advertisements in their magazine? Take that stuff with a grain of salt. And again, I think that the best analysis comes from your peers who are using people, or go down a vendor management strategy. Put them all on a proof of concept and take a couple of them. Don't pay for anything, and you shouldn't pay for a proof of concept, and say, hey, I'm going to see what value I get out of these over the next 90 days to 6 months, and then use that as your way to make a decision as to which intelligence feed you're going to buy. And if the vendor doesn't want to do that and give you the opportunity to use it and see if there's real value, they're probably not a vendor you want to do business with anyways.
So here's a successful question that I've asked intelligence vendors in the past as we're looking at, and it goes back to an earlier comment about efficacy. So if you really want to throw them a curveball and figure out whether they're going to truly give you the data that you want, ask them the duplication rate versus their peers. So they should be able to articulate this out. So if they're going to tell me that it's a 60% duplication against their peers, you get that 40% lift. If they're unwilling to actually have that conversation with you, I would exercise caution, because likely the feed that you're going to buy is mainly duplicates of things that you're going to get other places. So if their feed contains 90% open source intelligence, you're only paying for that 10% lift. Now you can understand whether or not you're making the right choice for the $10,000 or $100,000 you're going to spend. So if I were going to say to organizations, how do they think about their feed vendors? Ask them that question, see if they're going to actually answer it.
We have time for about one more question. This was asked probably a little earlier. I think some of this you touched on, but still interesting. How realistic is it that the CEO will understand the need for the spend? You spoke a little bit about what you share with the executives. How about the spend when it comes to threat intelligence?
I would never have that dialogue with the CEO. I would not go ask the CEO for threat and intelligence spend. I would tell them what my spending requirements and control requirements are for the totality that we think we need. And to be honest, like we talked about, in a lean environment, you can start doing it and getting value without ever having a budget discussion.
I would agree with Malcolm. I mean, that's not necessarily a conversation I would have with the CEO. It would be like me having to say, here are the 3 firewall vendors, and I'm going to choose firewall A. That level of detail is the wrong conversation in the wrong audience. I like Malcolm's approach where he says, here's what I need. Here's the level we've agreed on from a protection environment perspective, and we're going to be an A, B, C, or D. We chose to be a B. It's going to cost me $100,000 to get there. Trust me as your security professional, your subject matter expert, and your trusted business partner to make sure that we achieve B with the numbers we have. The details at the CEO level are really unnecessary at that point.
Great. I think that's all the questions we have time for today. I want to, on behalf of Mimecast, thank both Mark and Malcolm for leading the discussion today based on the ebook that the Cyber Resilience Think Tank put out just last week. For those who are not familiar, the Cyber Resilience Think Tank is an independent group. They're dedicated to discussing a lot of the cyber resilience challenges that people face in the industry today. And their goal is to put together guidance and prescriptive solutions and advice on possible solutions and share that back out to the industry to have these type of informed discussions. As I mentioned in the beginning of the call, we will have this recorded and we can share that out more broadly, but we appreciate and are interested in any questions that come in as a follow-up. So thank you for joining today and have a good rest of the day.